Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland and India's High Commissioner to Canada there today, both discussing relations in the wake of BC's RCMP arresting 3 Indian nationals and charging them with first-degree murder in the killing of a BC Sikh activist last year. India's foreign minister has accused Canada of harboring terrorists, but today the High Commissioner appeared to attempt to draw down tensions, highlighting the value of Canada and India's trading relationship. But with the RCMP's investigation ongoing and the Prime Minister's accusation of an extrajudicial assassination plot looming, where does the relationship go from here? Let's bring back the front bench. Brian Gallant, Rana Ambrose, Tom Mulcair, and Paul Wells. Paul, I'll start with you. I have the impression that both the federal government and the representative of India here are really trying to downplay any sort of tension at this point, which is not the case, let's say, even 6 months ago. Why do you think that is?
I think because they've got intractable problems in what is an important relationship for both countries. Certainly much more important for Canada than for India, just because of the relative size. But there's large diaspora communities. There are important trade. We're a major source of the lentils and pulses that India eats every day. And the Modi regime thought they could swat Trudeau away like an annoying little fellow. And they've had their bluff called quite spectacularly by these arrests and by the Biden administration's response. And so I believe they're starting to understand that this is not something they can shake off. It's got to be managed while the rest of the relationship is managed. The
only caveat I'd add to that, Rana, is that the RCMP and the Public Safety Minister are being super careful to say these arrests don't mean that it's a link to the government of India. We're still investigating that in a separate sense. The carefulness with which they talk about it is what sort of prompted me to observe that I feel like everybody's making an effort to downplay how bad things were, and there must be an economic imperative to do so.
Well, absolutely. I mean, from an economic point of view, I mean, you heard the India representative talk about, trade. There aren't that many restrictions on trade between the two countries, but it wasn't that long ago where India pulled visas and, and there was retaliation around lentils. But look, Canada made a decision to potentially pivot away from China in our Asia-Pacific strategy and focus a lot of our efforts on trade in the region with India. So this is an important economic partner for Canada. So, but the other piece of it is there is no real evidence that at least has been made public that that the RCMP has, that there's a link to the Indian government. There's obviously been allegations made by security services in the United States and the Biden administration, and there is, the Prime Minister made his accusation publicly, but the RCMP has to do its work and has to investigate. But if there is a link, this will blow up all over again, and we will have even more serious diplomatic issue on our hands.
Well, in the U.S., for example, there's a really, I'm going down a wormhole, Brian, but there's a really interesting investigation out of the Washington Post last week, which basically, made very clear that in their view, there is a link, but that the White House has actually been incredibly restrained in its response because of the strategic value it sees in India, as Rana pointed out, in countering China, essentially. That must be a sentiment felt in some way by the federal government here. Like, you need India to counter China.
Yeah, agreed. I think that's certainly the backdrop, and I'm sure that the Trudeau government, when this happened months ago now, certainly were aware of that as well. But they sort of, I'm sure, felt they had to do what they had to do in the interest of security. And I do think that you're right to say that both sides seem to be trying to focus, as Paul mentioned, on the sort of overall relationship as they sort of navigate this development. But I'm not sure I'd say that that's necessarily why people are kind of making the points, why the ministers and government are making the point to say, look, no, this does not mean that there's a link. At least, I'm paraphrasing, but at least not yet, right? I think it's more from a kind of procedural point of view and to make sure that they follow the right process and that people don't jump to conclusions. But to Rona's point, I mean, if there is a link that's found, it's certainly going to flare this up again. And again, to Paul's point, maybe they're going to still try to focus on the overall relationship for what you said, Vashi, because India is strategic and India needs Canada as well.
Tom, last word to you. I just quickly point out the link was, the Prime Minister said there was a link in September, right? He's the one that put it out there, that there existed credible intelligence. It's just whether or not the RCMP has enough to essentially prove it.
Yeah, and there must be some small satisfaction with Trudeau and his crew right now to see that the arrests have taken place, because it does tend to substantiate at least the core of the allegation, which was, that this was concerted and these were people from India. And now the link has to be made to what Trudeau, had, as you correctly say, Vashti, has already stated as a fact. It was the first thing out of his mouth when the parliamentary session started in September. And a lot of people, including me, thought, well, that was a nice way to distract from the fact that he was so far behind the polls with the Conservatives. But it was also blowing something up. And now we've spent months and months trying to get it back into relative proportion so we can maintain that important relationship with India. Something similar happened when Mr. Trudeau put his index finger under the nose of the Chinese president at a G20 meeting in Bali, Indonesia in November 2022. So 18 months ago, his staff bragged, well, he was giving him what for because of interference in our elections. And then he did everything when he got back to say, well, no, there's not that much and there's nothing to see here. Please move along. You can't do both at the same time and have it be credible. You can't do the big action of saying, this is the Indian government organizing the assassination of a Canadian on Canadian soil, and then continually walk away from it. So we do seem to have finally enough evidence to have given rise to these arrests. But I think that as a procedure with big international files, this idea of having this explosive event and then trying to back away from it, it's not the best way to maintain long-term relationships.